Hello, everyone. Welcome to the inaugural live stream for the Testament Talks. I'm Ryan, and we have Brian here. I said in my video earlier today, this is what it started all of our discussions this time last fall, was bringing this together. We had that great Facebook group together, but with technology and being able to connect with so many people, having this live discussion. So we're very excited to do the first one. A lot of, I think, blood, sweat, and tears up to this, huh, Brian, to get to where we are today. And everything's working. I hope everyone can hear us. It looks like everything's coming out.
He is the technology master. I am just the theology resource. If it wasn't for Ryan, none of this would be happening.
Yeah. So want to just say a couple things before we get in. We're very excited about this. Just a couple technology things. So we have the live chat open for you all. So we already had a couple questions come in that we're definitely going to answer through this. But if you have any more, or if we bring up a point that you like or want to discuss more, definitely let us know in the live chat. I'm watching it from here. A couple other technology things too is we're coming to you from the future. We figured out time travel. Well, no, what I'm saying is live streams are about a 15-second delay. So if you see us talking and then we ask you a question and wait for a reaction, there's about a 15-second delay from when we talk to when it gets to you, which think of all the technology to get to you. It's pretty impressive. It only takes about 15 seconds to do that. But and the other thing too is as you come in and out, or if you want to watch this, we are recording this too. So the minute we're done, this will be what's called a video on demand or a VOD that you can go back out to our YouTube channel and let us know or watch it again, or if people missed it. And we also are recording the chat. So if there's questions that come in, the people that watch on the VOD will be able to see that too. So I think that's exciting from that perspective. So if everyone could just throw in whoever's in with us, if you want to say a hi or hello in the chat, let us know you're here and give us a thumbs up, and we'll get started here. So we're going in. We've got 3 books, and we're going to do about an hour here. And I think we have a lot of talking. Brian, when we first started this discussion and going in, you told me Genesis was your favorite book in the Bible. So kicking it right off. So I'm going to throw you for a loop, though. Are you a new earther or old earther?
Oh dear. I don't actually have an opinion. It doesn't really matter to me if you want to know the truth. I'm a God made the earther. I really don't have a particular opinion. I'm probably closer to a middle earther than anything. Del Jacket has a really great video on YouTube about the flood and the age of the earth that's somewhat compelling, but you know what? I really don't have an opinion on that. I hate to disappoint you, but
well, I'll tell you, I grew up going to a private school, and they were very young earther, and that's basically if you believed 1 year over like that 6,000 to 7,000 range, you were believing the what do you call it? The evolution and all that. But what's interesting is grow older. I've listened to a lot of both sides of things. Like I said, I'd like to just hear the discussion. And we've talked about Preston Sprinkle. If you ever guys on the chat, if you ever heard Preston Sprinkle, he does Theology Raw, I think is his, and he has a lot of topics he talks about. And he had a paleontologist a few years back, and he was talking. He's like, I'm a Christian, but all I can tell you is I can look at the science, and we have fossils and footprints of dinosaurs, and no human fossils or footprints with them. So I can tell you. So it's not to throw you for a loop before as we get kicked in, but wanted to go in. I mean, what is your favorite part of Genesis, and why do you like it so much in what it tells us?
Well, I just finished writing I finished it a year ago. I finished writing a Bible study about Genesis 1 and 2 about a year ago. And I love those first 2 creation chapters. They are so rich, and there is so much that the ancient Israelite would have seen from those chapters that we miss because we read it with modern eyes. And so those are very precious to me. But I also am I wrote my master's thesis in seminary on covenant. And so I love God's covenant promises to Abraham. And I especially love when God actually walks through those pieces and says, I'll keep the covenant when you break it. That's one of the most precious parts of all of Scripture to me, and probably why I love Genesis so much. I love Abraham, Sarai, and their whole story, and all the cultural background that goes in that, which hopefully we'll get to talk to in a little while tonight. I love that story.
Yeah. And as we talk about here, I mean, Genesis, we kick like right in, we have creation. And then by chapter 3, we've already got sin in that fall. And by chapter 10, we've already got like the three major falls of, I guess you could say, humanity from that perspective.
Right.
So, when you look at that Genesis 3 perspective, what are your thoughts about that? And that's where obviously the serpent tempts Eve and Adam, and the whole downfall of man from that perspective.
Mike Heiser, who I've read a lot of and I appreciate deeply, and has really profoundly affected the way I read scripture and understand it. And he always says, if you ask a Christian today why the world is the way it is, they'll tell you it's Genesis 3. But if you ask an ancient Israelite, they will tell you it's Genesis 3, Genesis 6, and Genesis 10. Well, what's Genesis 3? Well, that's when the sons of God come down to the daughters of men. The supernatural beings mate with the daughters of men, and they really turn things topsy-turvy, because that's not supposed to happen. And then the Babel incident is later on, and that's when men try to get themselves up to God. And those are the things that really set everything else in motion. And most of the time, because we are Westerners in the 21st century, and we only look at Genesis 3 in the fall, and that was the first thing, and that serpent is again a supernatural being who's messing in the world and messing with those beings created in the image of God, and it leads to everything else. But it's one of the three facets that really drive the story, and it's the most important one, because from that moment on, Yahweh is always seeking the restoration of his relationship with humanity in various ways, and first through a people group, and then eventually, of course, through his son. So that
Yeah.
was a long answer to your question.
And what I would say is, what was interesting digging into Genesis 3 a little too, as we were talking about it here, is that I read the Moody commentary, and what they brought up is when God was looking for them in grace, he wasn't coming as their judge or to come down on them. He was looking for them as their father, and he had grace on them. But the other side too is it doesn't wipe away his judgment. Like, they obviously sinned against him. And one of the things that we talked about when we did this reading last year, that something I just never thought about, we think of this tree and God says, do not touch it. And we touched it so fast. We're only 3 chapters in, however long that was, we don't know, but we touched it pretty quickly here. And, and I think Joel, and I think a lot of people on our chat has come from Joel, but if everyone doesn't know, Joel Motamali, he has a doctorate. He is, and correct me if I'm wrong, but for Proverbs 31 Mysteries, he's the director of theology right there. He has his own humble theology. If you don't have it, go out on social media, Instagram, find him, YouTube. He's awesome. He's got a lot of great stuff. That's how we met. And he's a teaching pastor at my church, Transformation Church. So a lot of great insights. But he brought up something in a reel last time, and I even read it in my commentary this time around, was the intention of God that tree would always be off limits. And, what the Moody Bible commentary was saying, and what I read today, is it wasn't that Adam and Eve knew good and evil. It was the fact that they could be unlike God and use it in the correct way. And so we see God kind of throughout all of Scripture, it's on his time. So was it eventually that tree was going to be accessible when he felt humans were ready? What are your thoughts on that?
Most scholars agree that the whole purpose of the prohibition, you shall not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, was to command his creatures made in the image of God to obedience in one thing. That was it, one thing. And once they had successfully obeyed him by saying to the snake, no, we're not doing this. We know what God's word says, and we're not listening to you. Then the knowledge of good and evil would have been given to them as a matter of the course. And there's some beautiful writings on this. There's a scholar named Meredith Klein who was at Gordon Conwell for many years, and he has some beautiful writings about all the things that could have happened and what it would have looked like. And one of the things that's interesting is we never see the tree of the knowledge of good and evil again in all of Scripture. We see the tree of life; it reappears in Revelation, but we never see that tree again, which is very interesting. We don't get that second chance apparently at that. But I do believe that it was not forbidden forever. I think it was forbidden for a period of time until obedience was established.
Yep. And then, again, we're in chapter 3, and then only 2 chapters later, we're on our way to Noah, and we've populated the earth a lot. And we're to the point now that God says there is just too much corruption. We need to kind of, let's say, reset from that perspective. What are your thoughts? That's the second fall, and we're, not even halfway into Genesis at that point.
The Genesis 6 daughters of men and sons of God is it's
Mhm.
a tiny little piece in there that we like to rip right over. Joel's written a lot about it. He's got a book coming out. I think they'll have more about it. But clearly, as you mentioned, sin has just like rapidly perpetuated itself, and there's lots of extra biblical information as to why that was so and what it looked like that we're not going to pull in today. But obviously we do reach the point with Noah where God takes things into hand and basically starts over with a recreation story. And in the end of that saga, renews a creation covenant with Noah that he had originally had with Adam. And then things move on from there.
Yeah. And actually, one of the podcasts I listen to, they're doing they call it the foraging table, and they do deep dives into chapters of books, and they're actually going through Genesis right now. And if you can't tell, I'm a tidbit person. I like to kind of just the nuance. And one of the things they were talking about is you're bringing two of every animal in here, and there's only a certain amount. And then when when they get out, God tells them basically, you can eat meat except for the blood piece. And so, kind of the funny question would be was, are we not eating meat up until this point? And then on that, were animals eating meat? Did God make them vegetarians for the 300 something days that they were on the ark? Because they had to get there. We couldn't get rid of an animal. We couldn't eat one.
Some of the things we're not going to know the answers to, and then one of them is, did animals eat meat?
Yeah.
It is. We do not think that humans ate meat based upon what God allows them to do
Mhm.
post flood. So,
Yeah.
um, but
Yeah. I thought that
there's
was interesting from that perspective. And then we can move on to the final fall within Genesis, and that is Genesis 10. And that is, correct me if I'm the Tower of Babylon, correct? Or that's actually chapter 11, but right before that, from that perspective.
yep. So the human beings. One of the things you need to remember in ancient thought is that the ancient believed that gods lived in gardens and mountains, and especially gardens on mountains. And if you'll notice in the biblical story, they're on a plain in Shinar in Babylon, so they're in a big flat area. And in order to get to the gods, they got to build something. It's believed it was a ziggurat, and so they're getting themselves up to God, and obviously that's not God's plan, and so He frustrates it. And we know from the Genesis account that the frustration results in them all speaking different languages. But we know from Psalm 82 that what he also does in that moment is that he assigns the sons of God to the nations for them to steward the nations under him. And then many of the sons of God fall and cause the nations to fall and worship other gods. And we're going to see that as we go all the way through the rest of the Old Testament. So I'm not going to spoil the story for you. But that is the final thing where he sets the other nations apart, and then he picks Abraham, which is the next part of Genesis. So, and that's my story. I love the Abraham story.
And I want to pause here. We got our first message in live chat. Not a question, but I want to call it out. Thank you, Trina. She said, thank you for doing this so we can all get together. Great. We're already touching people here. That was the goal here. So that's great. But going back to Genesis from that perspective, and then, one of the things we always look at from the Bible, we're thousands of years, especially from the beginning of this. And one of the things that we look at is we try to apply a lot of this to our lives, and we're like, well, this doesn't make sense from this perspective. And I've heard a couple of pastors say this. My pastor, including I'm a big fan of Joby Martin out of Jacksonville with 1122. And we have to remember that the Bible, what they say, and I want to make sure to quote it right here, Bible was not written to us, but for us. And that kind of leads into the biblical culture. And, how does that play out in Genesis from your perspective?
I want to talk a little bit about this because this is something that we really miss because we're Westerners, and our society is not ordered around kinship. In Christian society, we do tend to order around family, but kind of nuclear family. There's no such thing as a nuclear family in the Old Testament. But in the biblical world, kinship ordered society. It ordered society. And the smallest portion of society is called the Bet Ab, and that means the father's house, the father's household. And it's more than just a kind of paternalistic way of thinking about things, because in the biblical world, the household included the father, his wife or wives, his married son, their wives and children, all his unmarried daughters, as well as all of the concubines he might have, all of the members of his staff, his servants, if he had slaves, all of those were in the Bet Ab, in the father's household. And the father of the household was not just a biological father. He was responsible for all of those people in his household. It was a big responsibility. In fact, this is how Abraham comes to be responsible for Lot, because Lot's father, Haran, dies, and Abram takes him into his household. So the father's the eldest male, and he's responsible for their welfare and their protection, and all of the decisions as the head of the household are his, even if he's deciding things for adults. So if you'll note, we began Exodus a few days ago, and when Moses, who is 80 at the time of the burning bush, when God speaks to him, but he still goes to his father-in-law, who's the head of a household, to ask him to let him go to Egypt, because he's the Bet Ab, he's the father. And Moses is beholden. He's lived now 40 years under his father-in-law's household, and he's beholden to him. So he goes. So that's one of those moments where we see the Bet Ab, the father's house, at work, actually in scripture, in the culture. Now, sometimes, when a father of the household dies, then his eldest son inherits the responsibility of caring for everyone in the household.
Mm-hmm.
And that is why the eldest son gets the double portion, because he has a bigger responsibility for caring for more people. It isn't just that the double portion was some, well, I love you more, or you're favored more, because it was to enable him to provide for all of those people who would be under his care. He needed it to care for others. Sometimes a household grows too big and one man can't care for it. There's a section in Genesis where Abram and Lot, they got too much stuff and their animals can't feed, and they separate out. Lot goes his way and Abraham goes his way. And that's one of those times where the family just grew too big to support them in a single space, and they had to move. So this is kind of the smallest unit of kinship. And when God says to Abraham, he says, go from your country and your people and your father's household to the land I will show you. It's not like just moving to another town or a job. It means leaving the basic building block of his life. It's the protective unit of his culture. It was a big deal for Abram to say to a God he had only heard from, okay, I'll do it. I'll go. Of course, when he went, he didn't go alone, because he had the household under him, which would have been his wife and all of his servants, and he didn't have any children yet. There also are growing units in kinship, because there's a clan and then there are tribes. And all of these people are generally related by blood. Blood is the glue of kinship in the ancient world. Your mother's father, sister's aunt's brother, but you're somehow related by blood. And that's why we see so many genealogical lists in the Bible, because that kinship was so important to them. They don't just outline histories, they define the identities of the people in Scripture, and they define who you belong to and who belongs to you. So the firstborn is a critical role and position in the ancient Near East, and birth was the way that the ancients kind of received their identity. We see a lot of times where the firstborn isn't the chosen one for some reason or another. For instance, with Esau, he despises his birthright because he considers the birthright promise of God to be worthless. It's worth a bowl of porridge, for heaven's sakes. He sells it for a bowl of porridge. And literally, Jacob becomes the firstborn because Esau has despised his birthright. It doesn't become an issue of chronology. It becomes an issue of who wants that role. And who wants that responsibility?
Yeah.
So did that help you with a little bit of the background of?
Well, and what I would say too is it made me think of something. So, and I don't have this written down, so correct me if I'm wrong. It was it Isaac that was it going after Rachel and that she was trying to sway her dad and he like tricked her and then he ended up spending like 20 something years with him before he was able to marry her and leave from that perspective. Was that Isaac? Please correct me if I'm wrong.
So that's Jacob. When after
Jacob. Okay.
Jacob had tricked his dad with he and his mom trick his dad into giving him the firstborn blessing.
Yes.
And he flees and he goes to Laban's house
That's
and
where it is.
he
Yes.
wants to marry Rachel. And that's a really important point because he asks to marry the younger daughter, which in that culture would not have been done if the older daughter wasn't married. So Jacob very much ignores and rejects the norms of the culture to say, I want your younger daughter. Because the father always took care of his children in birth order, and Leah would have needed to be married first. And when Jacob has worked for 7 years and poor Leah still hasn't been married, it's Laban's duty to get her married off. So he tricks Jacob into marrying her first. And the irony in all of this is that Jacob is a deceiver. He's deceived his brother, and then he gets deceived by his father-in-law into marrying the person that is not the person he wants to marry. But he's done a very socially incorrect thing by asking for the younger daughter when the older one is not married. And we don't see that because that's not normal in our culture.
Yeah. Well, I had the story right. I knew the names were going to be off, and that's why I'm glad I'm partnered with you on this.
Okay.
And kind of leading into that, and the kinship and everything from that perspective, and it kind of talks about the Judah and Tamar, and I mean, there's so much weight on inheritance, just like you said, like he gave up his inheritance for just a bowl of soup, but then even we see with Judah and Tamar again, correct me if I'm wrong, where their inheritance is at stake and Judah's is. Can you explain more about that?
So that's one of those stories that is steeped in cultural context, and it starts at the very beginning when Judah marries a Canaanite daughter, and that tells us something. That was like, you're supposed to marry somebody from the children of Israel, but you marry a Canaanite daughter, and his two oldest sons he got problems with. Now either he didn't step up, or his mother's Canaanite ways more powerfully influenced them, or both. But we know he marries his oldest to a woman named Tamar, and he immediately dies without having any children. Now, the oldest, the firstborn, needs to carry on the family line. And so there's this thing called levirate marriage. And if the oldest son dies, the next son in line must come and be with the wife and create a son that will then carry on the firstborn line. It was a duty in that culture. So Judah does as he's supposed to, and he marries his second son, Onan, to Tamar. And Onan does not want to have a child with this woman because he knows that son won't carry his name, and he, it's not going to be his son. So he basically doesn't help with the process, and it
Mhm.
makes the Lord mad because that is not what he's supposed to be doing. But there's more than naming rights at play here, because without an heir, Onan would have become the firstborn, and he gains a larger inheritance. So that's also what's going on in the background. He's trying to keep the firstborn share for himself, and his greed shames Tamar because it appears that she's barren, because months go by
Mhm.
and she's not become pregnant. And he also shames his dead brother just culturally. He's stealing his birthright by not providing an heir for him. And God considers this heinous, and he puts him to death. That's how bad it was. He puts him to death. Well, now Judah's like, I lost 2 boys to this woman. I don't think I can. I don't. So he does something that is also culturally inappropriate. He tells her, "Go back to your daddy's house."
Mm.
Well, she should have continued to live in his household under his care. He is failing his cultural responsibilities to her. Now, he's very superstitious. He thinks that she might be the reason his sons have died. 2 dead husbands seem like a little
Yeah.
bit too much of a coincidence.
I
And
think that's
so
still in nowadays too. There'd be a coincidence that we'd say.
luckily we know the backstory.
Yep.
When the youngest son grows up, she realizes, and who knows how much grows up is, could be 2 years, could be 4, whatever. Judah doesn't do his duty. She's living in her father's household. She's widowed twice. Her father is caring for her, but it is not legal, like it is not culturally supposed to be his responsibility. And we're supposed, when we realize that Judah doesn't do what he's supposed to, we're supposed to go, what? What? Why aren't you doing what you're supposed to? We're supposed to shake our heads in dismay because he's the father of the household and he's left her homeless and inheritance-less, and he's dishonoring his firstborn heir, heir. And so we don't. This isn't stated in the story, but culturally, this is what they would have seen. So Tamar does the thing that we think is just crazy nuts. She dresses as a prostitute. Her father-in-law's wife has died. She waits along the way as if she's a cult prostitute. He sees her. He he makes use of her services, leaves her with his seal and his staff, and goes away. And when he tries to bring back a goat for her, she's gone, and he doesn't think anything about it. But then he learns she's pregnant. Now, when people come and tell her she's pregnant, this brings shame on him because now she's associated with this family, and here she is. She's a widow and she's pregnant. So clearly she's done something wrong. They're shaming Judah by noting his failed responsibilities to his daughter-in-law because she has been guilty of prostitution because he has not taken care of her. The only reason you do that in the ancient world is a means to survive when no one will take care of you, and you're a woman without any means of support. As the father of the household, Judah was supposed to have responsibility to her to provide her protection and support and moral guidance. So he failed as the father of that household because he did not do any of that for her or give her a rightful inheritance. And that's how culturally they would have seen it. So, of course, we know how the story ends. She appears to him, she gives him his belongings, and he says to her, she's more righteous than me. Now, the story doesn't say that she's righteous. He just realizes that her behavior in getting to the thing that he should have provided for her is righteous. She was vulnerable and disempowered, and interestingly, Judah is the one who's in the wrong from the beginning to the end of the story. The Bible uses the story to show that Judah has not acted honorably towards his father, his family, his daughter, his sons, any of those people. It's an interesting take on Judah that we may miss if we don't understand how the family was structured.
And we have to move on, but one of the things I thought about in this too is like one of the things that hit me when we read it again, even reading it again this time, if we fast forward a little, like when Lot loses his wife and his daughters lose their husbands, like the daughters go to seduce him, and it's because they're worried about their inheritance. If they don't have their inheritance, there is nothing for them. So it's
Exactly.
like going back to what you're talking about, the culture back then versus now, and to us, it's like that was survival last year. I mean, you would die in the desert if you didn't have your inheritance from that perspective.
Yep.
And
You're
that
exactly right.
and that would lead us, and I know you've touched on it. I wanted to see if you had anything else on it, but with Jacob and Joseph, again, just the differences in culture. I mean, you got their brothers selling people. You've got Esau and Jacob, and all of this stuff just going on. And what's your take? I know you've touched on it a little more. Did you have anything else?
Well, the whole Jacob and Joseph story is another example of where, because we're Westerners and we're deeply individualistic, we see the story as all about Joseph, but the reader sees the story as all about Jacob's family. And from the very beginning of the story, it's about Jacob's family that gets torn apart, and will it get back together? Will it get back together? Will it get back together? It's actually about how God reconciles this family at the end. Now, Joseph, he was a daddy's boy, and he probably wasn't well disciplined, and he angers his brothers by telling them his dreams, and he tattles on them. And because of this, they take some action that's a little bit drastic, Now, we might think that that's Joseph's fault, but in that culture, they would look at us and say, this is Jacob's fault. Jacob needs to get a rein on that boy. Jacob needs, as the head of the household, to sort out the disagreements between his sons. He's got 12 sons. He's got a ton of sons. He needs to be in the mix, but he's not. Instead, he exacerbates the whole situation because he gives Joseph a special robe and he allows him to stay home with him. When he gives Joseph that robe, what he is saying is that Joseph is the firstborn of his family. He is, in fact, Rachel's firstborn, but he is not the firstborn of Jacob, excuse me. But he basically rearranges the entire inheritance scenario when he gives Joseph that robe. And that's one of the reasons the brothers are upended, because what will it mean for them if the inheritance is completely flipped and it's now going to Joseph? So again, it's a whole kinship story about, and it goes right back to how Jacob didn't respect patterns of behavior with relatives. When he asked Laban for Rachel's hand, he's not respecting the patterns of cultural behavior here as well. So he plays favorites, and Jacob pays the price. But it's interesting that even after Joseph gets sold, is in Egypt and working for Potiphar's house, he still has got a little problem. We kind of see that when Potiphar's wife comes after him and he says no, 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 and eventually he says to her, he says like, with me in charge, my master does not concern himself with anything in the household, and everything he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you're his wife. He states that he's the greatest person in the house, and Potiphar's put everything in his hand. And we're supposed to notice that Joseph has placed him above her, as well as all the other slaves, with the same arrogance that he treated his brother. So he's got a pattern of behavior here that the Lord has to change. And it doesn't change until he hits rock bottom in jail. He gets a new community. He does rise to prominence again, but at last he learns to live as a member of that community. And then things begin to change. And we think, wow, he's the head of Egypt, and this is it. This is what we're waiting for. This is what we're waiting for. But it's not, because the family's still not brought back together. The readers are waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting. And finally, Joseph uses his status to care for his family and to bring his family back together. And the dysfunctional family is restored, and we see sin overcome, and kinship has been restored. And that's how the ancient Near Easterners would have seen this story. They would have been finally happy at the very end when all the brothers are back together. And that, for them, was the whole point of the story.
Yeah, and I think it's so funny as we talk about Jacob, and I think we're gonna talk about Moses here, and then we get to David, and it's like we have hindsight, and sometimes we're reading the Bible and like, what are you doing? Like, can't you tell, like, God is trying to fix you, and you're gonna go do this, and put this above that and idols. But it's like, man, if someone wrote a book about me, I think a lot of people would be shaking and saying, what are you doing, Ryan? From that perspective. Um, I feel like we could spend hours on Genesis, especially being your favorite book. But looking, to move forward, anything else you wanted to touch on Genesis, and we'll move over to Job.
Now I do want to make sure we get to the questions we've got
Yes.
that people have submitted today, so we can make sure we answer those.
Yeah, and I think those are part of Exodus here. I had when we see.
They're both in Exodus.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So we'll keep moving through Job, and we'll make sure to hit those. Yep, we have the 2 questions from Sarah and Michelle, and people in the chat. If you have some, definitely we want to hit those. So, and we can touch quickly on Job. But when we did this last year, this is one of those books that you don't just pick up and read. So when opening, I'm just okay, going to do this Bible reading. Okay, we're in Genesis. Don't know why I'm going to Job, but going to Job, and then it's like, wham, like you don't know. And one of the things that out of the whole book, one of the things that just caught me, and I read so much about it, was I didn't realize that Satan still is in God's presence. Like I just thought, hey, like you're out from that, you get dropped off, you're out doing your thing, don't run into me, kind of thing. But like, was that figurative or literal from that perspective, that he still goes into that court and has to be in front of God for whatever from that perspective?
So that's one of those things where your English Bible does you a little bit of a disservice, because it will generally say Satan came before God. But in the Hebrew, The word Satan means the accuser, and the Hebrew is ha-Satan, which is the Satan, which is the accuser. So what it says is the accuser came before the Lord. And we don't actually get a definition and a name for Satan until way into the New Testament. And I remember in class a long time ago, I said to somebody, I was teaching the class, and I think I was talking about how Moses had to hide in the rock because, you can't be sinful and see God's face. And somebody said, how could Satan come before God and Job? And I was like, let me think about that. And then when I went back and read the Hebrew, it's not Satan, it's ha-Satan. So we don't know who that is, except it is someone who is asking God questions. And clearly he is able to come before God and be in his presence. And that's as much as we know. Our whole theology about Satan doesn't really, is not deeply developed at all, and doesn't become more formed until the New Testament. And then in Revelation, it gets really ratcheted up. And we don't talk about that till December. So
I feel like we just wrapped that up 2 months ago. I mean, we're back here.
I know, we did.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to
I'm
spend
seeing
more.
all new things this time. It's so funny.
Yes.
I've seen things. I'm seeing all new things as I'm reading through the second time.
No, 100%. And you'll hear me as we do these live videos. And I think I've told you, like, I grew up in the 90s. I have that felt board Sunday school, like, going into elementary, you see that felt board go up, you knew it was on that day. And they have their little things going up, but that's only for whatever, a 10-year-old, that's so part of the story. So like stuff just starts clicking when you read through the Bible and stuff you don't know. Like, I can't wait to talk about Jonah, because that's the one I was just like, oh my goodness, there's so much more to Jonah than just doesn't obey God, gets eaten by fish, obeys God, moves on with life. There's so much more undertone to it.
Well, and I feel like that about Job.
Yeah.
It's such a long book, and you can really get bogged down on all of the.
Mhm.
There's a lot of talking and a lot of people talking, but I can't remember if I don't know that I've talked about this in the group, but I'm a huge fan of the Bible Project. I have talked about that. And
Yes.
last 2 years ago, the Bible Project did a 23 series arc called The Chaos Dragon, and it is so good. I've probably listened to it
Yeah.
4 times, and I will listen to it again and again. But their episode on Job and the Chaos Dragon totally changed my understanding of the entire book. It's so precious. And to kind of distill it down, when the accuser comes and he's like, look, he's followed you because he got all the good stuff. Let's take the good stuff away from him. And God says, okay. And then he says, he's still alive. And God says, okay, you can kill him, but you can make him really miserable. And, all the conversations and all the people saying, you must have done something wrong, because in that culture, they believed that if you were suffering and you suffered loss, it was the evidence of your unrighteousness. And the whole story is getting to where 2 things: that is not the case, and and yet God is still just, even though that's not the case. But by the end, all Job has is God. Well, he does have his wife, and she may not be a real benefit, but he has God. And at the end, it is more than enough. It is more than enough. And he has one wish, that he could see God's face. God has filled the void and become the thing. And I never got that until I went through the Chaos Dragon series in the Bible Project. And now I've come to love the book even more. And I've loved it for a long time. It's verbose. There's a lot of stuff, but it's super precious to me now because of that understanding that I've kind of gleaned through that study.
Yeah, and
Also, just as a point, I would not put Job at the end of Genesis if I was creating my own chronological Bible reading, which I'm probably not going to do. I would put it probably at the end of the story of Abraham, right around there. The thing to notice in that story is there's no reference to the children of Israel. There's no reference to geography. There's nothing that ties that story to anything other than Job and God. It's fascinating in that sense that it doesn't point back to anything. Noah, I mean, there's no genealogy in it, and yet it is considered, part of the wisdom literature of the entire Old Testament. So
Yeah. And we forgot to mention this, like I'm learning with you guys. If you guys see me taking notes and stuff, first of all, making sure everything's working. I got a lot of little things going on my computer. So I pulled out my study Bible here just because I know at the beginning here they put the historical background. They say the events take place in the country of Uz,
yeah.
which was located in the northern Arabian Peninsula. The date of the writing is unknown, but Jewish tradition places it during the time of Moses. So yeah, it seems like it could be later because we're not even at Moses yet at this point.
Yeah, but there's no law. I mean, there's no people of God. So that's part of what makes it so fascinating for me.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, man, we can spend so much time, but I'm looking at time, so definitely want to spend the rest of our time here in Exodus. And I know you wanted to talk about the plagues, but the one thing I wanted to hit is in that chapter 1, and this comes from J.D. Greer. He's out of, and I try to give references where I learn these things. Summit up near you, actually, and we were talking about those midwives, and if you think about it, they are lying to Pharaoh about killing babies. And
Right.
we look at the Bible and say, well, we're not supposed to lie. Is it ever acceptable to lie? Like if we go back to the Holocaust where they're hiding Jews or anything, like are we going against God by lying, by hiding people or saving babies in this? And how JD, he has a whole like 15-minute podcast on it, but what it comes down is he says there's a narrow exception in lying. It's when it prevents you from sinning or breaking God's law. So obviously killing people made in the image of God that are innocent, babies, or the Holocaust, Jews that are being persecuted for who they are, at least by what J.D. Greer says, is you are preventing another sin or breaking God's law by helping them or saving them. What are your thoughts? Any thoughts on that?
Not really. I think JD's probably right.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, yeah, I think that the midwives are the first heroes of that whole chapter, and I think I mentioned last week that the chapter turns on women, on the things that women do. So I don't have a particular Bonhoeffer has a lot to say about this, and I'm not going to rabbit trail on it, but Bonhoeffer has a lot to say about the practical uses of truth and everything. So,
well, even if he talks about little white lies, like my kids say, "Are you eating something?" No, I'm not eating it because I don't want to share with them. So it's like, well, I mean, you're technically lying to your kids there in that perspective. Okay, but we definitely want to talk about the plagues, and your notes are saying, we have 10 plagues. And like, where do they line up? Like, why did God choose these 10 plagues? Was it specific or kind of random from that perspective?
So in Egypt, there is a pantheon of gods. I mean, so many of them. And of course, the Jews are down, the Israelites are down in Goshen, but they would have been exposed to all of these gods on every side. And so as we've come to understand Egyptian culture in the last 300 years through all of the archaeological finds that we've basically identified that each of the plagues is pointed at the power of a certain God, because Yahweh is showing that he is the God, the high God, the one. And so the first plague is the water turned into blood. And this plague targeted Hapi, who's the god of the Nile. And there are a few other deities, Osiris and Tauret, but they all have to do with the Nile and the vital water sources of Egypt. The frogs is the second plague, and it is directed at Heket, who is the frog-headed goddess of fertility. The third plague is lice or gnats. Some translations say different things. And it challenged the god Geb, G-E-B, who's the god of the earth, and Set, the god of the desert. It showed their inability to protect the land from the infestation. The fourth plague is flies. It's not linked to a specific deity, but it's probably a mockery of a beetle-headed god named Khepri, who's associated with the sun. The death of all the livestock has multiple Egyptian gods that it's targeted because there were multiple gods associated with cattle, and They included a god called Hathor and Apis and Ptah, Ptah. So as you can see, lots of gods. The boils on the skin challenged the goddess Isis. She's the goddess of medicine and peace, and it demonstrated her powerlessness to heal. The hail on all the land challenged Nut, N-U-T, who's the goddess of the sky, and probably a few other agricultural deities as well, because the hail destroyed all of the crops. And then there's the locusts, and it targets Osiris, who's also the god of vegetation and crops, as well as a god named Senaham, and he is associated with protection from pests. The ninth plague is darkness, and that would have been a challenge to Ra, the sun god. Now, there were some other sun-oriented deities, but Ra is the top god and the sun god, and he is associated with Pharaoh. And then the last one is the death of the firstborn. And it's the final plague, and it's a judgment on all of Egypt's gods, as well as Pharaoh himself, who was considered a god in that culture. And it demonstrates Yahweh's power over life and death. And those 10 plagues, one at a time, would have pointed out the total powerlessness of all of those gods in Egypt.
Yep, and Michelle just said in the chat, this makes much better sense with the reason of the plagues. And yeah, when you told me about this and I was reading about it too, and it's like, we always look at this, it's like, yeah, God didn't just say, hey, here's some frogs, here's some boils. And like, even we haven't got to Elijah yet, when he just flat out challenges their gods, like, hey, light all this stuff on fire, let's see it. And then they do it for hours and nothing. Elijah just says, boom, and, hits it from that perspective. And it's just, these themes and these imposters that God can just call out exactly against it.
And I think it's important to point out that God is not random. I mean,
Mhm.
there's nothing random about what's in his word. It is very, very precise, even though sometimes we have a hard time translating certain aspects of it because the wording is difficult or whatever. God is not random, and he's very precise. He was on a mission to show that he was the high God, and he's not just showing it to the Egyptians, he's showing it to the children of Israel, because they
Mhm.
haven't had a lot of this for the last 400 years, and they need the message too.
Yep. And looking at the time, I want to make sure we had a couple more points, but I want to make sure we get to the questions. So I think we're going to jump there, and if we can backtrack if we have some time. So the first one, I'm going to kind of put them in order where I felt like they went in the Bible too, and because they're both from Exodus. So Sarah Steele asked on your question is, and I'll read it in case of the people that don't have it here, is one thing I was thinking of that I would like some feedback on is in Exodus 32, the latter part of the chapter where Moses can instruct or was instructed by the Lord to have the men kill each other. Got blessed in verse 29, and then the next day they all got reprimanded. Moses made atonement for them, and then the whole golden calf, gods of gold thing was brought back up, and they got punished for it as well? Question mark. I guess I'm not understanding what's the purpose of was killing one another. Was it to cleanse
Right.
the camp?
Yeah. So at the end, Moses asks all those who are with him to come to his side, and the Levites come. And the Levites are his tribe. Don't forget, he and Aaron are from the tribe of Levi. And then he says, go about the camp and kill all who are not with us. This is probably the first time and we see, maybe in the Pentateuch, how serious God is about
Hmm.
following him. Um, the Levites are the future priests and the keepers of the tabernacle, and they show their faithfulness to Yahweh and to Moses, and they're tasked with the cleanup, basically. It's
Hmm.
intended to show us the dire seriousness of idolatry. Those 3,000 people were people that would have kept on worshiping that calf forever. And Yahweh's not messing around. If you're not going to be faithful, you will die in the wilderness. And that's a message that you will hear again and again and again throughout the rest of the Pentateuch.
Yeah, and when I looked this up, it was right along those lines, and it was some matter of fact where it says that these individuals were most likely continuing in that idolatry and debauchery. And
Right.
really, the Levites had a hard thing. It was, I mean, this was with their brothers, like, and they had this to go in, but they were dedicated to it. And they got a blessing. And then the one commentary I was reading said this shows God's character. First, he's merciful, gracious, slow to anger, and forgives, but he will not leave the wicked unpunished. He must deal with evil if he claims to be good. And that's what we saw. They had a chance to step back. They did not. You had the Levites and whoever else did. And then the people that didn't, they had to be taken care of.
Yep. And
Great.
I'm really glad she asked that story. I
Mhm.
mean, that question, because I think we need to talk about these things, because these are hard things, and there's going to be a lot of hard. I mean, when we get to the sons of Korah later on, there's a little phrase where him and all his little ones. It always breaks my heart, but it is such evidence to us of how, first of all, how serious the Lord is about the faithfulness of his followers, but also how sin gets into the camp
Mhm.
and can spread and has to be stopped. It has to be stopped.
Well, and what's crazy, and I know we want to jump to this last question, but like God is not that far away. Moses is just up the mountain getting the Ten Commandments. Like they know they can't touch that mountain. It's not like he disappeared
Mm.
like 100 miles away. Like they're still right there, and still it's not enough for them.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. So moving on to the last question we had received here, and it was from Michelle Nichols. And so this is going over to the tabernacle. And it says, every time I read about all the sacrifices in the tabernacle, I just picture how it had to look with blood and the animal parts all about. So I have these questions. Was there any protocol for cleaning it? And why all of the sprinkling of blood? Like, why did we do it? Or why were they commanded to do it, I guess?
This was a great question, Michelle. And I have to tell you something. I never thought about the cleaning of it before. So I did some research on it. The Bible does not explicitly detail a
Hmm.
cleaning protocol. There is provisions for the cleanliness of the priests. They're to wash their hands and feet before entering the tabernacle or approaching the altar. There's a big bronze basin that's filled with water between the tent of meeting that's specifically for washing. And then the ashes from the burnt offering are to be removed and disposed of out of the camp. I had to go to the Mishnah, which is an extra biblical document developed by the Jews between like 200 BC and 200 AD over about 400-year period. It was codified by, like, for sure by 200 AD, and it has all kinds of rules and regulations. It's the fence rules that the Pharisees would have used with Jesus, and it reveals that the priests employed several measures to maintain the cleanliness and the hygiene in the tabernacle. They themselves had the regular washing, and then they removed the ashes. For the blood management, and I'd forgotten this, the tabernacle was designed with aqueducts and water channels
Hmm.
that let blood and other remains outside and eventually would flow out. And the temple had the same thing. When the temple was constructed, it had the same channels that took all of that stuff out of the temple. And oftentimes those remains could be sold to farmers for fertilizer. So the tabernacle and, well, the temple would have made a little cash on that. There was also a weekly cleaning of the altar and its ramp. It was cleaned every Friday before the Sabbath, with a certain type of cloth to remove the blood stain. And there was a biannual washing twice a year. The altar is whitewashed using a lime trowel. So hopefully this maintained the cleanliness. I had just never thought of that before. I thought it was fascinating.
Hmm.
Let's talk about the sprinkling of the blood and the sacrifices. So it is a deep spiritual significance. Um, the blood has, first of all, it's for the cleansing of sin. It's seen as a purifying agent. It makes atonement for sin. It's for consecration. It sets apart people and objects for God's service and use. And it's a covenant sealer. When you see Moses enact the covenant with the people, he takes the blood and he swings it all over the people. It symbolizes the sealing of God's covenant with his people. So it represented life, and it's the means through which forgiveness and purification are obtained. I hope that helps with that. Every time I read the passage about Moses, like slinging the blood out of the people, I'm always like, I would have to go wash my hair. All right, let's talk about the medals. So that was one of her really good
Yeah.
questions.
Oh, yeah. The
Um,
middle of this.
the, the medals had deeply symbolic meanings. The gold represents God's kingship and his glory and his holiness, and it is used for items inside the tabernacle, representing God's presence and his deity. The use of gold in the holy place and the Holy of Holies signified the increasing revelation of God's glory and excellence. Then we have the silver, and it symbolized redemption. It's associated with redemption and grace, and it was used to make the sockets at the bottom of the sanctuary, implying that God's house rests on redemption. And the silver hooks and the fillets that are used at the pillars represent God's grace as displayed in man. And then we have the bronze. It's the least costly and precious metal, and it's used for items outside the tent, including the altar for sacrifices, the laver for cleaning. It symbolized God's judgment and the earthly realm, and it was used as, again, outside where sin is dealt with through sacrifices. The bronze altar represented the place where sin was judged, which was supposed to point to Christ's sacrifice on the cross eventually. In terms of like a spiritual progression, the bronze in the outer court, as I just said, represents the judgment of sin in the physical realm. The silver represents redemption and grace, bridging the gap between judgment and holiness. And the gold in the inner sanctuary represents God's divine nature. And it is so fascinating. The last 2 days, 3 days maybe, we've read such incredible detail about the building of the tabernacle. And it's, Moses got the directions, and now we're watching the implementation of the direction down to the detail. And I'm going to leave this question out here for you guys. Why do you think all that detail was included in this? Because really today I was like, there's a lot of detail. Why do you think it was included? And I also want to point something else out. The Israelites had been slaves in Egypt they've been in Egypt 430 years. They've probably been slaves for at least 300 of that, maybe 200. But whatever, they didn't have a lot of stuff. But you'll remember after the plague of the deaths of the firstborn, when they leave Egypt, the Egyptians don't just say go, they say, go and take my stuff. They give them so much stuff that the text says that's how the children of Israel plundered the Egyptian. So they left Israel with a lot of goods, and they'd never owned very much, I'm going to guess. And I find it so fascinating here at this portion of scripture where God calls them and moves them to give it back to him, the person, the being who gave it to them in the first place, to his service. And it mentions that they gave and they gave. It says, don't give us any more. We don't need any more. We can't use any more. But I think to what God gave them and how they've given it back to him. And that's how it's supposed to be in our lives. Nothing we have is our own. And whatever we're given, we're supposed to give back to him.
Yeah. And I have 2 points. I think the second one might answer your question a little. And I know Michelle just added something. So going back to the goats real quick, my pastors during the way at Church to talk about this a little is they actually have 2 goats. So you have the one in the cast lots, and you have the one that is sacrificed. But the actual second one is where we get the term scapegoat from. And that's where, and I wrote it here, that is where we presented alive to the Lord to make atonement by sending it into the wilderness. So luckily for that one, he's the scapegoat. We put the atonement on it, and then they send it off into the wilderness from that perspective too. And then going back to what we're talking about, why certain things were picked, and I've heard this talk before, is we look at this sometimes, we're like, man, why does God have all of these rules and requirements? I mean, even down to the specifics of how something is made. And it's not that, like in what I've listened to and I agree with, is it's not like he's trying to control us. This is, he wants to be in our presence and worship, and this is the way to do it. He has given, this is an instruction manual on how we, especially in the Old Testament, how we could be in front of him and do it in with all of that perspective. And what Michelle added too is I've always wondered if the detail was a form of practicing obedience in his commands. And I think it kind of comes along with all of both things. There's practicing, but it's also God wants us to be in his presence. This is the way to do it.
Michelle nailed it. It is. So this is called command fulfillment language in the Old Testament. God's given all these commands to Moses, and we see that all the workers fulfill the commands. They are doing what God is telling them to do, and it's very important. We'll see command fulfillment language all the way through, and a lot of times it will just say, "And the Lord said, do such and such, and so did such and such." Here, it's a much longer, text for all the things. But she's exactly right. It's to show the obedience. It's to show that they were fulfilling the commands of the Lord. Absolutely.
Yeah. So we're right about time, and we forgot to mention this. We don't want to end. We're still talking. We might go a little over. We don't want to be how some pastors get really into something they have to finish real quickly from that perspective when they get over their time. But we've read some good books. We've gone from Genesis, which is a great story. We know a lot of it. Job, which I think was new to us, but still a story. Exodus, a story we know. But starting tomorrow, we're heading into Leviticus and Numbers after that. And
Tomorrow?
Def,
Oh, it is.
yeah.
Oh, it is.
So
I got some words coming for you guys on Leviticus tomorrow.
yeah, so obviously some hard books to read, a lot of laws, a lot of repeating. We're kind of like, man, lots of names. Any encouragement for the group?
Yes, I've posted this. There'll be posts coming up tomorrow about Leviticus. I think it might have been you last year, Ryan, that says Leviticus is where chronological Bible readers go off the rails.
Yeah,
get off the
I have the meme ready. It's ready.
Yeah. Okay. So it is. So I've got some things coming up about how to read it. Don't read it from a 21st century mindset. Kind of try to read it with the eyes of an ancient Israelite. Remember that these are things that are intended to set the Israelites apart from the nations around them. Notice how detailed God is in what he's saying and doing. And don't let it bog you down. Don't let it bog you down. Don't be scared, as my little boy used to say when he was, don't be scared. Just,
Yeah,
we'll
what I learned last year in reading those, it's kind of what we just talked about is, first of all, like, these are forms of obedience. So maybe doesn't pertain to us right now, but it shows us how God worked with them. And then, like, the list of all those names, I mean, I'll be the first to admit, I didn't read every name in there when I was skimming. So if I didn't read technically the whole Bible, I'll call it out. But it's the overall, why is that important? And you could bring it back to is, I mean, that's the evidence of the Bible. That's the genealogy. There's a reason all those names are in there, even if it's only in there one time. It's because we need the genealogy to get from Adam to where we are today through Jesus. And that's where a lot of this lays out. It gives you the tribes and everything else. So I think, my encouragement as someone that did it for the first time and made it through last year is, again, what you said, don't get bogged down that, oh man, why do I have to read 500 names in 3 chapters today? It's get through those names and understand why those names are in there. And it's just maybe a high level paragraph from that perspective, like why it's important those 500 names are in there. So.
Yep.
Yeah. So I think, looking through, Vanilla said, great point, Michelle. And Michelle said, we're looking forward to it, Brian. So everyone's looking forward to your content. As we wrap up, I mean, we made it through the first live stream. The audio worked, the video worked, nothing went down. I'm excited. Yeah, I was very nervous coming into this. This is why we put this whole group together. We got through one. I think we're pros now. Any last closing thoughts before we end tonight?
Yes. So if you're watching this is a culmination of Ryan reaching out to me in September, trying to figure out what technology was needed, finding the technology at a very reasonable price so that we could afford it, and then figuring out how to pull it all together so that we could do it as a live stream. Honestly, I could never, ever have figured out how to do this. This was way beyond anything I could have imagined. And when he first started talking to me about it, and we were just kind of playing back and forth, and he came up with several names, and I liked the Testament talks, and then he came up with this cool logo, and I was like, Lord, what are you doing here? You're using this sweet guy to just drag me onto this thing. But that's what God is doing, y'all. He's using Ryan's technology and the call he has on my life to just teach the Bible with people who want to dig deep. And I would just be remiss if I didn't give God all the glory, but also Ryan all the thanks, because this has been such an interesting journey that I never expected to be on. And I can't wait to do it again and to continue to study and talk to you guys about it. And I hope that it's blessed you, because it's surely blessed me.
Thank you. And I think we talked about this. We had never even talked until fall, and we connected because I do this at work all the time. I host calls for what I do in cybersecurity and talk to people, but bringing in, and I felt this need, but I was like, I don't have that additional knowledge. And I think it was a perfect match, as I can bring the technology and help with some of the hosting, but you've got that knowledge to be able to dig in. And so I think that was very exciting for us. And now I think before we get out, I gotta take a picture so you guys can all see all this crazy stuff I got set up. We get it all here. See if I can get up. And I'm connected. If you see, I have headphones because I got to hear Brian. Plus, I have a bunch of audio alerts if the system went down. See if I'll post a picture here. Get a picture. See all this setup here. But yeah. So no, we want to thank everyone that spent their time with us tonight. We know everyone's time is precious, and we really felt this calling. Even every hiccup that we went through trying to get here, the hiccup came, and there already seemed to be an answer like right away after. It was truly amazing from that perspective. Stuff just started clicking. Even the sickness we just went through. I mean, Brian was down and out. Like, she couldn't even talk to me on the phone. And then my family going through sickness. And, it's that calling where, devil's going to, I think, try to do everything he can to stop something in this. And I think we have a good thing here in the fact that we continue to do it, and we look forward to doing it. There's so much that can be done in reading the Bible. So chronological, I learned it last year. I was someone that couldn't do it. And if we can just encourage people to get to the end of it and do it, it opens up so much. I have a list from last year of stuff I want to dig into, and I've already started to. So with that saying, we want to thank everyone. The VOD should post pretty much right away when I end this live stream. It'll be out there. We'll make sure the link's out there. Continue to participate in the group. Invite your friends. Just because we're already a couple months in, get them in. Say, hey, go watch the Bible Project for the chapters we've already done. Come join us where we're at, kind of thing. The Bible Project will get them right to where we are. So if you get discouraged, the other thing I want to hit, you're going to have times you get behind, whether it's a day, 2 weeks, a month. Don't let that stop you. If you get back a couple days, find a way to catch up. Or if you get a month behind, watch the Bible Project, get to us. Yes. Yeah. There's no reward at the end of this. We don't have a certificate. This is your walk between you and God. So if you get to the end, whether you did some Bible Project stuff, whether you read every word, it's still getting you closer to God. And that's where I think the encouragement comes from.
We love you all. Thank you so much for joining us. And if you're watching this afterwards, join us live the next time, because we're going to do it again next month.
Yeah. Bye, everyone. Have a good one.